We've been singing Psalm 23 each Sunday of Lent, so our psalm response today is likely to feel very familiar. However, today the antiphon is verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. What is the valley of the shadow of death? Some describe it as a place of darkness, severe suffering, and anguish, where one cannot see the way out with the human eye, where it requires faith to be led by our shepherd, the Lord. Despite the darkness, the psalmist trusts and walks on through the valley because he is not alone in the valley. He is with the Lord, and being with the Lord allows his faith to be stronger than his fear. We all have dark valleys in the journey of life, and the women in our readings today are no exception. In our first reading from Daniel 13, Susanna is described as a beautiful and God-fearing woman who seeks to do what is right. The two men, who are elders of the community and who Daniel describes as wicked, are in the positions of honor and power. Each of these men lust after Susanna and spy on her as she walks in the garden. One afternoon, when Susanna is alone in the garden, the two elders pressure her to give in to their lustful plans or else face a false accusation of adultery. At this moment, Susanna is walking through a dark valley of fear and vulnerability, but she chooses to walk through it with the Lord and to stay faithful to his commands by refusing to give in to the elders and withstanding their false accusations of adultery. In order to understand the remainder of this story, we need to briefly review the Jewish law of this time. To be sentenced to death for adultery, there had to be 2 or more eyewitnesses whose testimony agreed on every single aspect of the situation. If the witnesses did not agree on every single aspect of the events, then the witnesses would be the ones sentenced to death. And for this reason, as well as the fact that the act of adultery usually took place in private, it was highly unusual for 2 or more witnesses to come forward accusing someone of adultery. In this case, the 2 elders think that their status and position will allow them to succeed with their plan. As a woman, Susanna was not allowed to testify or defend herself. So she looked to a higher authority. In the midst of everyone, Susanna cried out in prayer to the Lord, and she spoke the truth, even as evil sought to destroy her. At this moment, Susanna is completely overwhelmed and surrounded by the evil of the valley of the shadow of death mentioned in Psalm 23. And when all seems lost and there is no way to save herself, God works through Daniel to set things right. Daniel is a young boy at the time, but he speaks up and he exposes the lies of the elders. And in the end, the elders are punished for their false accusations, and Susanna is saved. The contrast between Susanna's purity and innocence and the 2 elders' corrupt desires and manipulation make her a wonderful heroine of faith and trust. However, the lectionary pairs this reading with the story of the woman caught in adultery, and the connection between these 2 readings may not be immediately apparent. But these 2 stories teach us a lot about how God's love washes over corruption and brings light into even the darkest valleys of life when no solution seems possible. The story of the adulterous woman begins one morning as Jesus comes over the Mount of Olives and into the temple and begins teaching the people. The entrance from the Mount of Olives into the temple symbolizes the return of God's presence and mercy among his people. As Jesus teaches the people, a group of Pharisees and scribes come into the temple area and with a woman whom they say they caught in the very act of adultery. To place this woman in the middle of the crowd, imagine her there, humiliated, both physically and emotionally exposed and subject to the mob that is closing in upon her. And despite the Jewish law requiring that both the man and the woman be convicted of adultery, this woman is all alone. She is walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And in her heart, she sees no way out of this valley. But even in her brokenness, Jesus sees her heart. As the story unfolds, we witness Jesus' compassionate love healing the wounds of her soul. This woman is being used as a pawn by the scribes and the Pharisees who seek to trap Jesus. These Jewish leaders partially quote Moses' law by saying, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? At this point, Jesus kneels and he writes on the ground with his finger. What is he writing? Some theologians surmise that he is writing the words of the prophet Jeremiah, which say that those who forsake the Lord will be put to shame, and their names shall be written in the earth. The scribes and Pharisees continue to question Jesus, who then says, "Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone." There are a number of Pharisees and scribes who have dragged this woman into the temple area. But who is willing to put themselves on the line as an accuser? Remember, there must be 2 or more eyewitnesses, and they must be in agreement on every single aspect of what happens. If they are not, then the supposed witnesses will be the ones stoned. With Jesus writing the words of Jeremiah on the ground and the full understanding of the Jewish law ringing in their heads, slowly, one by one, the accusers dissipate from the crowd. The woman is left there with Jesus, who does not condemn her, but forgives her and tells her to go and sin no more. She was in what seemed like an impossible situation, where she was certain that the shadow of death had overcome her. But the light of Jesus' love reveals the true nature of the scribes and the Pharisees, and it brought compassion to this vulnerable woman. Today, you may feel like someone who's walking through the valley of the shadow of death, where it's dark, and the eyes of our hearts strain to see any light up ahead. Perhaps this dark valley is the result of our own choices and sins, like the woman caught in adultery. If so, God's compassionate love invites us into the healing balm of reconciliation, where Jesus says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Or perhaps we are like Susanna, who is caught in the dark valley as a result of other people's selfish desires. If that is our story, then God reminds us that he is walking with us through the dark valley, and he is the shepherd who will guide us into the light. Or perhaps God is calling us to be like Daniel, and to be the instrument by which he shines his light into the dark valley that someone else is walking through. No matter where we see ourselves, we are not alone. The Lord is with us.